Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Giacometti Institute. Welcome to this École des Modernités lecture. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Denise Murrell, who is next to me. Thank you, Denise, for accepting this lecture, and thank you also for accepting to give it here in Paris, because I think this gives a sense of something especially related to the topic we're having tonight, because we're talking about artists who at some point spent some time, long or brief for some of them, more long than for others, in this city at another moment of its history. Denise Murrell is the Merrill H. and James S. Tisch Curator at Large at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She earned a PhD in art history from Columbia University in New York in 2014. Then after, she curated the exhibition Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet and Matisse to Today, that had a venue at the Wallace Art Gallery at Columbia University in New York. And she also co-curated the iteration of this exhibition at Musée d'Orsay. I'm sure everyone in the room or online saw that exhibition, Le Modèle Noir de Géricault à Matisse, in 2009. Denise Murrell curated the Met's 2024 exhibition, The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism, and the catalog was edited by her, accompanying catalog too. The invitation was prompted by this show because of the narrative that the exhibition offered, and I'm very interesting to go more into depth about some aspects of the movement in relationship to Paris. Aspects that were partly in the exhibition, but of course the focus of the exhibition was way broader. So tonight's lecture is entitled Connecting in Paris, Exchanges Between the Harlem Renaissance and European Modernism. And it will bring forward figures such as William Johnson, Meta Warwick Fuller, Archibald Motley, Laura Will Waring, among others, on a time, and that's an aspect that interested me most, that they came to Paris and built something on their return to the United States, whether in New York or for some of them in other cities such as Chicago. And another aspect that you'll see in this lecture is the connection those artists made with artists in Paris or connected to Paris somehow that lived in Europe, such as Munch, Matisse, or other names. So thank you again, Denise, for accepting this lecture and for introducing us to all those networks, all those weaving lines that we're fascinated to learn about. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you for having me, and I am really enjoying this opportunity to speak in a smaller environment tonight. We've been in some very, very huge spaces over the last couple of days with the museum, exhibition openings, and so forth. And I'm realizing it's been a few years now since I've been in a classroom-like setting, and this feels very comfortable and familiar. So although I had written out most of my remarks, I'm gonna try to be a bit more conversational. I think probably, Hugo, it would be best to wait until the end if anyone has comments or questions, but please make notes, because I'm very interested in your thoughts and your observations and questions about some of the material that I'll be going through. And I've started here this Harlem Renaissance, this movement, the Harlem Renaissance, is so grounded in the interface between art, literature, performance, music, including music, classical, jazz, performance, dance, song, etc. And I wanted to make the point up front that portraiture, depictions of writers by the artists of the movement, was an essential component to our having a sense of the values, the aesthetic values, the ideas in terms of cultural as well as political and literary, and all of this kind of conflates into an activism that I think kind of blends on both sides of the Atlantic into some of the early days of Pan-African alliances that crossed all of these fields. So I wanted to start with this display of some of the thinkers who, we're talking the early 1920s and earlier, and the fact that these writers, for the most part, were from the very beginning looking to bring new ways of thinking about their own culture, their own ancestral heritage to the fore, but also thinking about linking their respective backgrounds to other creatives of other backgrounds who had had certain common objectives. So we have Alain Locke here. He was a professor at Howard University, professor of philosophy. He was a very insightful art critic and theorist, shaping a lot of the ideas that informed the work made by Harlem Renaissance artists. But he was a philosopher. He was transatlantic, just almost by definition. He was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University in philosophy. So part of his studies involved living and working, being affiliated with universities in Germany, and extensive travel across the continent. And he maintained that during his career and advocated, exhorted artists who were part of the movement to do the same thing. His book, The New Negro, published in 1925, is the publication that gave the movement the name by which it was known at the time. The term Harlem Renaissance is retroactive. The artists and writers of the period refer to themselves as the New Negro. And one of the things that has come up a few times is, well, how does the New Negro translate into French? And I think the important line that I wanted to draw, and a number of other Black French scholars wanted to draw, is that it's not nègre, it's noir, okay, something like noir. It was aspirational, it was self-affirming, it was reclamatory of the dignity and value of cultures that had been marginalized and denigrated. So these New Negro artists and writers were, that objective was central to their project. And then this portrait of the Nardal sisters. And I am still learning about Paulette Nardal and her two sisters, who founded a publication, La Revue du Monde Noir, a review of or publication of the Black world. And from the very beginning, it was bilingual, and they published writers from all around the Atlantic, Europe, the US, Latin America, Canada, and so forth. As did the Crisis magazine. The Crisis magazine was the publication of the NAACP, very prominent in the 1920s through the 40s. Its editor, W.E.B. Du Bois, and we'll hear more about him later, was also very transatlantic in his perspective, and I'm showing here a cover illustration depicting René Marin, who was the first Black French winner of the French Literary Prize. I'm saying all of this because I'm usually speaking to an American audience. I know that you know, but the first Black winner of the Prix Goncourt. And so here he is featured in a cover story in the NAACP's magazine, and an illustration by Albert Smith, who was an African-American artist, permanent expat, moved to France in the 20s and lived around Europe for the rest of his life. So these are the transatlantic, I think, affiliations that I want. I feel like I'm moving. Did I skip a slide? Hold on. Yes, okay. So, so before we get into some of the substance of what these writers and their collaborations with artists produce, I just thought it'd be helpful to take a quick look, an overview of what some of the objectives of the Harlem Renaissance artists were within their own culture, within the US. And what they were essentially attempting to do was modernize the perception and the portrayal of the African-American subject, and to transform the popular notion of the African-American population as rural, as illiterate for the most part, and Southern. And this transformation of imagery was to accompany a transformation in the culture, in the society itself. This movement unfolded in tandem with the Great Migration, which was one of the largest migration movements in the history of the US, still is today. Ultimately, millions, some estimates are from 4 to 6 million African Americans beginning in the 1910s left the rural South in search of greater freedom from the racial terrorism of lynching, state-sponsored violence, legalized segregation of public and private facilities, education, job opportunities, just moving in massive numbers away from the rural South. And this led by certainly the late 1920s, to the first large concentrations of populations of African Americans in several cities around the US. The largest was Harlem, but there were cities including Chicago, the South Side Chicago neighborhood, Oakland, California, and a number of mid-sized cities in between the coast that expanded. There'd always been Black populations in these cities, but organized as a community and in numbers that could support performances and literary readings and publications and that sort of thing. This was the beginning of that. But these artists were looking to portray all aspects of this new of life, of modern life in these new Black cities. The idea that the African American community was becoming urbane, not just urban, but urbane in terms of being attended to, being attuned to literature, music, going to concerts, going to dance clubs, going to the local library for readings, much like the discussion that we're having tonight, but with a full range of stylistic approaches. And so here we see William H. Johnson, who Hugo mentioned, based in Harlem. He was part of the Great Migration, moving from rural South Carolina, got several years of artistic training at the National Academy of Design, and lived and worked in New York for a number of years before he moved to Europe, coming here to France, and we'll look at what happened once that move was made. But we're seeing sort of the tail end of his artistic development here. This is 1939-40, so he had spent the better part of 20 years, the 20s and 30s, in France and then Scandinavia before coming back to the US and taking on the Black subject. And he's engaging with this kind of expressive, sort of non-naturalistic treatment of the figure, in line with Alain Locke's call for attention to African aesthetics, which focus on disproportionate scaling of the head and the hands, but also the jazz aesthetic. I mean, there's a half moon here that implies this is early evening. The title, Street Life, these folks are out for a night on the town, someplace like the Savoy Ballroom, to hear the new big band sound that was emerging in those clubs during this era. And the jazz aesthetic is also about not catering to conventions, sartorial conventions, bright colors, interesting individualistic combinations of different styles, garments, etc. Improvisation, Langston Hughes, the jazz aesthetic is about individuality and improvisation. But then we have Archibald Motley, Southside Chicago was his base after he had moved from, his family moved from New Orleans. Middle class, bucolic, public park gathering, the type of thing that would have unfolded in a very segregated situation south of Washington, D.C. And he too is using certain avant-garde aesthetics, a more naturalistic treatment of the figure, but non-naturalistic color, for sure. I don't know if you're getting a good enough blow up, but that tree trunk, if you see that in person, is actually purple, rather than the brown or the gray or the shades of brown and gray that you would see in observed reality. And he's depicting skin tones that are clearly people of African descent, but they're interesting, fascinating blends of pinks and yellows and blues to create this brown. So, and we'll see how he develops some of that aesthetic during his time in Paris. And then, so you have the middle class, you have the, the folks who are out on the town, and then you also have what the eminent scholar Rick Powell, who I believe spoke here just last year, calls the boys in the back room, okay? As one critic said, you don't necessarily want to know what they're up to, and they're not going to tell you anyway. So, so high, low, everything in between. A number of these artists, Bearden in the 60s, going back to the early 40s, read Charles Baudelaire very closely, the flaneurs, the painter of modern life, roams the city, goes everywhere, observing, depicting, capturing in aesthetically interesting ways. So everyday life in the new black cities. Photography was a big part of it. The eminent photographer, Harlem Renaissance photographer, was James Van Der Zee. And this middle photo here is one of the most widely reproduced images of the Harlem Renaissance. It really captures this idea of urbane, stylish, affluent, not wealthy necessarily. I mean, many folks were. They were migrants from the South trying to figure out how to get a foothold in urban economies, but they made an effort to present in a way that broke with the types of stereotypes that were prevalent in popular culture. Part of that was hairstyling. Madam C.J. Walker, this is her salon, the first black woman millionaire in in the U.S., making her money from hair styling products, but she always had a very elegant salon designed by black architects, the interiors. The stylist got etiquette lessons. This is a tea. This is they're having afternoon tea and following certain, rituals associated with that. But then always the eccentric, the street philosopher. This is actually the barefoot philosopher, is the prophet, as this is titled. A known figure. I mean, there is information about him. He set up a soapbox pulpit on street corners around Harlem, and just but so again, all aspects of city life. And then just very briefly here, you see the stylistic contrast. Charles Alston is paying attention to the aesthetics of African mask, but also European modernism, the pictorial flatness, this very elegant, elongated neck. More than a few folks have said, well, this makes me think about Modigliani. I haven't come across his saying that himself, but they were looking at similar styles of African masks from Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, et cetera. And just this kind of flattening. There's no naturalistic curving or rounding of the figure, a blank background rather than ornate interiors. So engaged with European modernism, whereas Motley is depicting his gallerists as elegant, successful, but in a much more classicized way. Just to look at the self-portrait, the double representation, Samuel Joseph Brown, evocation, literary evocations, W.E.B. Du Bois, the souls of black folk, the double consciousness that he defined as emblematic of the African American psyche, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself, but being aware that one is being looked at in a highly judgmental, racialized, judgmental way, and constantly debating what mode of self-presentation to present to the world. So art imbued with the values coming forth in the literary and philosophical writing of the period. And there was a base for this writing, which in the publications of the period, I mean, these artists, for the most part, were not getting museum shows or gallery representation. Very episodically, one or two, Archibald Motley in particular, there was all his nightlife scenes were somewhat popular. So he might have a gallery show every now and then. But the way a lot of these artists first came to public awareness was through these publications that I began to reference. So here we see the NAACP's Crisis magazine again, the National Urban League. They were the second largest civil rights organization in the US. They published Opportunity. W.E.B. Du Bois was the longtime editor of the Crisis magazine, 35 years. And Charles S. Johnson, who later became the president of Fisk University, one of the major historically black colleges. And they commissioned artists for covers and for illustrations throughout. And then by the late 1920s, there was a particular annual show sponsored by the Harmon Foundation of Negro artists. And they often referred to these publications to even identify artists to contact. So just trying to create some kind of public awareness and in line with the aesthetic values of Locke, who wrote quite extensively for Opportunity, published in Opportunity, occasionally Crisis, but also W.E.B. Du Bois, who felt that aesthetics were a form of activism and maybe more comfortable with the more classicized styles of representation as we see here, but art with the purpose of improving the perception and the opportunities of the race. And so those were African American publications, and these editors were primarily academics. I mentioned Alain Locke. I'll just mention what we have here. This is a scene. This is a cafe at the Sorbonne, and then this is the Jardin de Luxembourg. So we're this is right here in our neighborhood, right? This is Alain Locke, the Harvard philosopher, author of The New Negro, with a young Ralph Bunche, an activist, diplomat who rose to great prominence later. And they're depicted in a cafe at the Sorbonne. And the important thing about this is that this photograph is by Louis Thomas Achille, who later became a professor at Howard from a black French family. He was connected, I think, as an in-law to the Nardal sisters, and so he published in the La Revue du Monde Noir. But so Locke and Black French artists and writers meeting each other, social, both of them having transatlantic careers. Howard University, the largest, I think, at the time, historically Black university in the U.S., otherwise known as HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. These were the main opportunities for African Americans to have higher education. So from the beginning, these institutions were international and Pan-African in their faculty. And so this helps us to contextualize why we would see Renee Marin on the cover of Crisis magazine, but also La Revue du Monde Noir. I don't know how well you can read this. One of these days, we're going to go into the archives and make some good high-res images. But this was the publication of the Nardal sisters. It was short-lived. This is the first issue in 1931. And this is the cover, no illustrations yet, but the roster includes a number of Black French writers from across the diaspora, the continent, Caribbean, European, including Louis Achille, but it also includes Claude McKay, who was a very well-known African-American writer, and Paulette Nardal. And one of the things, this is the very first volume 1 of the 6 that were published, and she stated that the mission was to be a space, a bilingual international space for the creation of a Black an international Black identity and a sense of self-awareness, but also awareness of the context in which other populations of African descent were living, working, and acting. And then this is one of the final, this is the volume 3. She introduced a handful of illustrations, and this is a print by Aaron Douglas, who was one of the most prominent African-American artists. And you can see the TOC here, Claude McKay again, but also Langston Hughes and Renee Marin. So international cast and bilingual. Langston's titles are and Claude McKay's titles are in English. So that's the context for this transatlantic modernism that engaged the Black populations, the Black intellectual community on both sides of the Atlantic. And in just a few minutes, I'll broaden that to show how the interactions with non-Black or white European modernists was definitely a part of this picture as well. But so how did this type of transatlantic translate into, how was it transformative for artists? One of the big issues that was debated within these publications was the question of African versus Western aesthetics. We saw the range of the styles that these artists use. Do you inject the Black body into classical tropes that have historically excluded the Black body, as artists does with the sculpture on the right here? Do you adhere very strictly to the formality of certain African aesthetics? The middle sculpture here is by Ronald Moody. He was a Black British sculptor who was successful in the UK, but also had regular shows here in Paris, so he had interface with African-American expats here. He was the only non-American artist who was included in these early New Negro shows that I spoke about. Through his contacts with Alain Locke, a number of his sculptures were regularly shipped to the US to appear in the shows that he was curating. And then, you know, the third way, of course, is synthesis. And just to take a look at that a little bit more closely, this is Palmer Hayden. Palmer Hayden was part of a migrant family coming from the South, settling in, I believe he was based in Washington, D.C. He worked as a janitor, okay? But he also took art classes at the library and so forth. And this painting, The Janitor Who Paints, was made toward the end of his career as he's looking back on how his artistic career unfolded. And he's, exaggerating some of the circumstances, but he's basically living in the type of accommodation that a janitor could have and trying to support his young family. He submits an application to the first of these annual African American shows and walks up to the curator, introduces himself in person, and just really essentially talks her into letting him be in the show. His work attracted some critical attention. He got scholarships and grants, and ultimately moved to Paris and lived and worked here for a number of years. So he ultimately moved back to the U.S., spent some time on the West Coast, but also New York. But Fétiche Fleur is probably, and the fact that he's using French titles for his work, let's see, did we correct it? Okay, well, anyway, but Fétiche Fleur, this idea of synthesis, can you blend the aesthetics of an Africa? This is a Fang reliquary from Gabon with a traditional European still life. And he's pointing out the affinities, the commonalities of materiality, the dark wood of the Fang of the reliquary, but also of the European style furnishings. The rich patterning, this is a Central African Kuba, raffia cloth on the table here, rich geometric patterning, but then there's not quite as formally geometric, but a rich patterning in that drapery that the raffia cloth is beside. And so color, texture, patterning, materials, does it make sense to even attempt to blend these, or does one have to choose one or the other? And I'm always beguiled, intrigued by the ashtray here in the front with the cigarette. I kind of imagine him, as an artist having made this work, and he's stepping back, what have I done? Do I dare show it to anybody? Should I burn it? Whatever. But he finishes and signs the painting. So these types of issues play out in the careers of many artists. We looked at William H. Johnson's portraits earlier. As I mentioned, he, as a young man in mid-20s, moved to France after having migrated from South Carolina, studied at the National Academy of Design for a number of years. And he came to Paris on a scholarship. And L'Académie de la Grande Chaumière, another neighborhood institution here, he and many other artists took classes there at various times. And they were teaching pretty classical or traditional styles. So this kind of neo-impressionist, 1920s is, it's post-impressionist, right? So this is almost part of the old masters, the way in which he's working. One of his instructors or mentors was Chaim Soutine, and ultimately the two of them both settled in the south of France in Cagnes-sur-Mer. And they sometimes painted together. So I showed these two scenes from the south of France. One is a view of Cagnes. The other is an old house at Port. And then I showed these two to show kind of the affinities with kind of, the loose, the values, the kind of mannered values of Impressionism at this point. But one of the things that also happens while he's in Cagnes is that he meets a Danish artist, Helga Craik, a weaver as well as a painter. And her brother-in-law, I think it was, Kurt Wall was a German expressionist, okay? And they began to travel together around Europe and North Africa. And so when Johnson gets around to depicting the village, Cagnes, he's beginning to introduce some of these expressionist, swirly, leaning, heavily impastoed, as opposed to, that sort of quick brushstroke of Impressionism. So in France, he is exposed to the way that art history is being taught by the French, but he's also exposed to international European modernism. He ultimately marries Helga Craik, moves to Denmark, and spends the better part of 10 years between Copenhagen, a small fishing village on the North Sea of Denmark, and for 3 years he lived in Oslo. He had regular gallery shows. He was in Oslo represented by the same gallery that represented Munch. They knew each other, not collaboratively. They didn't work as collaborators, but he had that level of visibility. And so you see this kind of expressionistic gesture beginning to dominate. He kind of moves away from Impressionism. He is evoking, to some degree, this seated man, this kind of African treatment of the face and hands, disproportionate scale, but, this Van Gogh-esque chair. So you're seeing these multiple influences that shaped by 1939. He came back, he and his wife came back to the U.S. as World War II broke out in 1935. And so by 1939, he was very well established, having lots of shows around the U.S. And this type of portrayal of these modern black figures is considered to be not only his iconic style, but one of the defining styles of the Harlem Renaissance. And just the transformation in his own, he made many self-portraits. So you see him as a young student just before he moved to France, and then you see his self-portrayal has a very different personality 15 years later. A number of women artists really found a measure of freedom from, I'm speaking about African-American women artists, from spending time in France. Lois Mailou Jones, and I'm not gonna say too much about her because we have the leading scholar, Kelly Christina Grant is sitting here, and she's writing a really important doctoral thesis on Lois Mailou Jones and her engagement with French Impressionism and so forth. But I'm showing this painting because we have it in our collection, and it's a good example of the way that when she was an art teacher at Howard University, she had a contentious relationship with Alain Locke. Like a lot of the, it's the period, gender issues. They were not about to welcome women artists into the ranks of leadership. They were assistants, they were working for, and so forth. She felt frustrated by that. She started coming to Paris during the summers. She also spent some time at, it was like Ron Chamier, wasn't it? Or was it? No? I'm sorry? Okay, all right. But, she wrote about the way that she was getting a fairly academic style of training, but she was also in the galleries and seeing African art and, all over. And she started to work with African aesthetics herself. Her teachers didn't necessarily encourage her to do that, but she said, well, look, if these European modernists are working with an African tradition, then this is my rightful heritage, even more so. And so you see the range, the stylistic evolution over time. Likewise, Augusta Savage first tried to come to Paris in 1923. She was turned down for a fellowship. 7 years later, she was here. She was taking courses. She wrote about one course where she was able to hire life models who reminded her of Amazons. And that helped her to conceptualize what became her iconic sculpture, which is titled Lift Every Voice and Sing. It is based on a song by the composer James Weldon Johnson, composer activist, that almost immediately, and still is today, considered to be the Black national anthem. It is sung at numerous cultural occasions. And it was monumental. She talked about learning about monumentality during her time in France. 16 foot tall, commissioned for the 1933, I think it was, World Series, World's Fair in Long Island. She eked out a living by teaching art at a public art school in the Harlem on 135th Street Library. Despite having this prestigious commission, she didn't have the funding to move it afterwards, and so this sculpture, this 16-foot tall sculpture, was destroyed when the World's Fair was dismantled. And what we do have are these desktop scale, finely worked. She had some ambivalence about them, but she was aware and she did not attempt to stop it. So they were made in editions, and a number of museums have this today. But the communal, sense of community, but also the individuality, every one of these heads is different. This is the type of compositional theorizing, strategizing that she felt she was able to pursue with more freedom. Laura Willow Waring, her painting here, A Girl with Pomegranates, I think is intended in part to reference her own early years coming as a student and as a young art teacher to France, going to the south of France on sketching trips, as depicted in this pastel off to the side. But she, as she settled into teaching at Cheney State outside Philadelphia, an historically black college, she became more engaged with the social and cultural issues that were part of African American activism, the color line, skin color difference, both in terms of black versus white, as well as within the black community, and what those implications were for the black female figure. So she was able to get her fairly classicized training during her time, her several visits to France, and has attributed this as being a major step toward finding her own visual language. And I forgot to mention, you're seeing all these green. I talked about the historically black colleges and universities, and I wanted to indicate the works that were in the Met's show. A lot of these images come from the show that were from HBCUs or from artists' family collections, many of which have been in these families for over the better part of a century. No interest by museums or the art market, so they languished, and we did a good bit of conservation work to bring these back to gallery-ready condition. And a lot of people were very happy to discover the early work of Laura Willow Waring. She had some fame in the late 1940s, but almost none of her 20s and 30s work has been published, let alone shown in a museum. And these issues, these society issues of family and society, were certainly gendered. Women artists feeling that they could find greater freedom being outside, having some option to work and study outside the U.S. at least some of the time. But gender identity, sexuality, queer identity, a term that we would use today that would be very sublimated at the time. A number of the leading artists and writers, including Alain Locke, are understood to have been gay, but none of them publicly lived that life, only one or two exceptions. However, Harlem was one of three neighborhoods in New York City in the 20s and 30s where there were spaces of gay sociability, as manifested as James Van Der Zee, a depiction of an individual dressed to attend a drag ball. Harlem had several very well-known, very lavish. They said the food at the drag balls was a lot better than in the jazz clubs. People came from all over the city and even traveled from outside the city to go to them ornate costumes and attire. So that's in New York City, Harlem, Greenwich Village, and Times Square, were the neighborhoods where this spaces of sociability existed. But then Beaufort Delaney, probably a name that many of you recognize, he left the United States as a young man, became a permanent resident of Paris, very rarely went back to the US, and here we have a portrayal of a rare, sensitively rendered black male nude. And this figure is generally assumed to be James Baldwin, the writer who also moved to the US more or less permanently, although he also, moved to France, spent time in Turkey and elsewhere, but ultimately settled in the south of France. And Baldwin did go back to the US. He was very much a part of the leadership of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the later years of his life. But so, Beaufort Delaney depicting his friend, James Baldwin, while living and working in Paris, in tropes that, in a visual style that would certainly engage with, the type of abstraction, expressive gesture, non-naturalistic color, lack of formal line, the way that the figure is composed. These are the modernist ideas that Delaney was involved with. Making non-figural work. As Alain Locke said, artists are not going to be relegated to the ghetto of always having to depict the black body. So making still life in a whole range of styles, or landscape, was something that several artists felt more enabled to do after their time working outside the US. But city life, the various aspects of city life were part of this project as well. We saw Archibald Motley at the very beginning. He was our cover image. And here we see him. He made a number of paintings during the 1 year he spent in Paris in 1929. And thanks to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a number of those works have been saved. They have needed restoration, but you see him moving around the city. He initially stayed in a hotel in Montparnasse. This jockey club, apparently it was quite well known at the time. You probably can't see from this image, but there are images of Native American, either blanketed figures, shall we say, with black hair parted in the middle, typically read as either Native, sort of a stereotypical French view of Native Americans or possibly Mexicans, as well as a cowboy. So those were murals that were on the wall of the Jockey Club because it was in a heavily touristed district. But then Motley, unlike most of the expats, was fluent in French. He was from a black Creole family in New Orleans and moved to Chicago from there. So he was able, when he was here, to ultimately move up to Montmartre, and we see him here depicting cafe scenes, terrace scenes, and interiors of the cafes in his neighborhood. But Motley is probably best known for his portrayal, his incredibly vivid portrayals of nightlife, both in a US context and this painting, which was on the right here, which was made in Paris. Black Belt, this is the South Side Chicago, the entertainment district. And again, a lot of these paintings are in HBCU collections or still with the family. And the vivid color, this sense of swirling humanity, people from all walks of life convening in one place. That drop-in hotel in a nightlife district is a definite, insinuation as to what people are doing in that space. But so in Paris, he made typically daytime scenes, but this is one, the Jockey Club is an exterior of a nightclub, but blues, and he himself pointed out in later interviews that blues was a misnomer. It was used by some gallery that his family momentarily considered selling this painting to. They ultimately did not sell. It's still in their collection. And it, as he has said, depicts a black French nightclub. So getting back to these, Pan-African affiliations among the writers, here we have an artist, a black artist in Paris, who is depicting Paris in a way that is very seldom seen in broader, in the mainstream of European modernism. He said that this club would have been frequented by people from Martinique and Guadeloupe, and they'd be dancing to a meringue or and they were not, these instruments may appear to look like the instruments of jazz, and there were jazz clubs all over the area, but this was a black French nightclub. So giving visibility to the multi-ethnic aspects of 1920s, 30s Paris, I think, is one of the things that emerges from a worldview that says we want to form alliances and affiliations and make manifest the presence of black populations wherever they are. That was not necessarily so-called mainstream modernist, made significant by only a handful of paintings in comparison with their overall body of work, but paintings that Locke himself specifically singled out and admired as modernizing portrayals of black Europeans. And this happened in France. Matisse, I'm showing here one, I think I have the two, okay, we'll get to the second one later. This is one of 4 of his final easel paintings made at the Villa Le Rêve in Vence, where he spent World War II before he turned to paper cutouts. The woman is a biracial Belgian-Congolese journalist, Elvira van Yft, whom he referred to as Madame van Yft. She was the wife of the Belgian consul for the Nice consulate, and they lived in a villa up the hill from Matisse in Vence during the World War II years. So they were in the same social circles, and she was in a reading book, a reading club together with Matisse. Her family, she just still has extant family, and they have books that the club read, and the various members, including Matisse, inscribed them with notes and so forth. So she was a woman of some means and social standing, a woman of color, a woman of African descent, and he's depicting her here just as one of his many icons of mid-century elegance. None of the traditional tropes of black femininity in terms of exoticized jewelry and so forth. So there's Matisse. And then I talked about Munch. He made 6 portraits of an African assistant. We had one of those in the exhibition. Kees Van Dongen was Dutch, but he spent most of his career here in Paris. This painting was made here. And he depicted society figures and showgirls, the fact that this is titled Les Plumes Blanches, the white feathers, the sartorial, the hair, the hats, the headpieces, the dresses were as much a part of, and maybe even more, part of his portraits than the individual themselves. We don't know the identity of this particular model. And then the Nola Hatterman, a Dutch painter depicting this young man, Richard Drenthe, who was a jazz musician, very well known to the touring American jazz bands like Duke Ellington and so forth. So there were European modernists who were making portrayals that met the acceptance of black modernists. And Locke actually tried to do shows, including European modernists together with African American, but museum exhibitions were rigidly segregated at the time. He was flat out refused on exactly that basis. They didn't make any bones about it. It's conceptually flawed to try to show the Negro together with the Caucasian, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of that correspondence at the Howard Library. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the exhibition is to try to combine, to show these traditions together and show the affinities, the influences. There weren't always influences or collaborations, but there were definitely affinities. Okay, so I'm gonna get close to the end now. This is just Matisse again, and I wanted to point out this Aisha. Loretta's very well-known Italian model, but Aisha Goblet was a denizen, a socialite, very well-known here in the Montparnasse area. She covered magazines, and there were fetes at La Coupole and the Dome and other places where she was the center of attention. Just showing two here of the four Matisse. Picasso had a collaboration with Aimé Césaire. This is an emblematic portrait he was an illustrator, the illustrator for a book, Corps Perdu, Lost Body, by Aimé Césaire. And this is an emblematic portrait of Césaire by Picasso that was the frontispiece for the book, and one of about 40 lithographs that he made over a period of 2 or 3 years. A lot of correspondence between the two of them. As in all cases, he's the illustrator for a book. He's working for Aimé Césaire, but in a very collaborative way. He also worked with the photographer Man Ray. One of my colleagues, Wendy Grossman, has done a lot of research on the Guadeloupean model dancer, Adrienne Vidalin, who was part of the social circles in the south of France of both Man Ray. She was Man Ray's companion, and they hung out together with Matisse and his companions of the period. And so she is, there's ongoing research to try to attribute her as the model for a number of Matisse paintings and certainly Man Ray photographs. So working with makers, working with muses, these European modernists were finding their path. And excavation, Germaine Casse, a black French, a French person, a mixed race French person of some African heritage, who helped to start the first artist salon in the Antilles in 1924. And this is her poster depicting that. We did a lot of work. She had exhibitions in France, several exhibitions in the 1920s. She was named to the Legion of Honor, so she was quite prominent in her time. All of her portraits have completely disappeared. I'm showing you excerpts from a catalog, an exhibition that took place in Paris in the 1920s. But she was covered by the Afro-American, a Baltimore-based newspaper that interviewed her and wrote short reviews of her exhibition. So again, these types of transatlantic. Ronald Moody, I mentioned him earlier, close to W.E.B. Du Bois. And making a portrait of Moody's brother, Dr. Harold Moody, started the first civil rights organization in the UK. And Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois were both members of that organization. So this is very extensive, these transatlantic affiliations with both black and white Europeans. So I'm going to close. This whole idea of activism, history painting. Here we have Aaron Douglas depicting he was famous for his murals depicting various aspects of American history, and this is a post-abolition scene. It's a 9 by 14 foot mural, one of 4 that are in the Schomburg Center in New York. And then on the other hand, we see a mature Laura Willa Waring here making this also larger than life, 7 foot tall portrait of the African-American opera singer, Marian Anderson, who left the US. She was not accepted at American opera houses, had a successful career in Europe, and was famously denied a concert in Washington, D.C. that led to a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so this portrait depicts that historic moment. So history painting, capturing these moments in the early years of activism. And just showing here beginning, the beginning of picketing, the depiction of race riots, the first civil rights marches, which took place in northern cities, not in the South. The model was imported to the South from New York, Boston, Baltimore. This is 10,000 people, a march to protest the continuing prevalence of lynching, which is the public torturing and mutilation and murder of African Americans. There were dozens of these things happening every year in the South. And the fact that this could be a peaceful march on Fifth Avenue, but taking that model to Selma and Montgomery and elsewhere in the South, police brutality and the confrontation of that during the Civil Rights Movement. But I want to leave this sort of activist gesture was part of this transatlantic worldview that the artists and writers of the period attempted to convey. This is Aaron Douglas, and this is titled Building More Stately Mansions. It's a mural that is intended for display in the International Students House at Fisk University, the HBCU where he was head of the art department for decades. And you see the backdrop of ancient Egypt, but the steeple of a Gothic cathedral, the stupa of a Buddhist monastery, and of course the never-ending cranes, the rebuilding, the construction of cities like New York and Chicago and so forth. So the way that these African American artists and writers use visual language as well as activist strategies and literature to advance what ultimately became the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. We end this period in the 40s, but in direct alliance with the Pan-African movements that were working against colonialism from Europe and the Caribbean and elsewhere. So that's, this is a legacy, just this a block in Harlem today, or it was actually 50 years ago, but the international city that Harlem is today, depicted in a manner by a mid-century collagist, Romare Bearden, that evokes the types of paintings and street scenes and so forth depicted by the Harlem Renaissance, an enduring legacy of a visual language to represent the hybridity of African American and indeed international Western culture. So thank you very much for your time.